For a long time, nothing happened. No headlines, no warnings, no reason for anyone to pay attention. There was no crime scene yet, no suspect, not even a story. Just a man living quietly, almost completely unnoticed. Years later, the FBI would call this the longest and most expensive manhunt in its history. But in the beginning, there was only silence. This is Panda Detective Bureau, and tonight, I want to start this story before anyone knew there was a danger at all. He was born into a family that valued discipline and intellect. Nothing about his childhood looked broken from the outside, but very early on, something set him apart. He wasn't just intelligent, he was exceptionally intelligent. So intelligent that adults began to talk about him instead of to him. Teachers noticed, researchers noticed, institutions noticed. And before he was old enough to understand what that meant, he was already being measured, tested, and labeled. Gifted. That word followed him everywhere. Being gifted opened doors, but it also quietly closed others. Other children didn't relate to him. He didn't relate to them. He struggled with conversation, with connection, with the unspoken rules that make social life work. What came easily to him, academically, felt impossible emotionally. And instead of being taught how to bridge that gap, he was pushed further into it. When he was still very young, he became part of a psychological study. At the time, it was presented as academic, harmless, even prestigious. What it actually involved was repeated, structured confrontation. Participants were challenged aggressively. Their beliefs were attacked. Their reactions were recorded. Again, and again, and again. For some children, it was uncomfortable. For him, it was formative. Years later, this experiment would be cited, debated, and quietly criticized. But by then, whatever damage it caused had already settled in. As he grew older, his view of the world hardened. He saw modern society as artificial, manipulative, and destructive. Technology felt invasive. Institutions felt dishonest. People felt shallow. This wasn't a phase. It became a framework. He wasn't just dissatisfied. He was convinced something fundamental was wrong with the direction of humanity. And worse, he believed no one else could see it. Eventually, he made a decision. Not dramatic, not impulsive. He stepped away from cities, away from careers, away from academic recognition. He chose isolation deliberately. A small cabin, no electricity, minimal contact. To outsiders, it looked like withdrawal. To him, it was clarity. He wasn't hiding. He was watching. For years, nothing happened. No violence, no threats, no crimes. Just letters, written, thoughts, refined, anger sharpened quietly. This is the part most people skip. The long stretch where someone is becoming dangerous but hasn't done anything yet, because it's uncomfortable to admit how invisible that process can be. By the time the first device was built, he had already spent years convincing himself that action was the only remaining option, that words had failed, that conversation was pointless, that disruption was necessary, but no one else knew that. To the world, he was still invisible, and invisibility, when paired with certainty, can be far more dangerous than rage. The first explosion didn't feel like the beginning of anything. At least, not to the people investigating it. It looked small, contained, almost incidental. No manifesto, no warning, no clear message. Just damage, confusion, and a question no one could answer yet. When authorities arrived at the scene, they were met with something unfamiliar. This wasn't a random act of vandalism, but it didn't look like terrorism either. The device was crude, yet carefully constructed. Whoever built it knew what they were doing, but didn't seem interested in making a statement. At least, not publicly. Investigators treated it as an isolated incident. That decision would matter later. In the early days, there was no sense of urgency, no nationwide alerts, no task force. Why would there be? The target didn't fit a category. The method didn't fit a profile. The suspect didn't exist yet. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't personal, and it wasn't obviously political. So the case stayed small, local, manageable, and quietly misunderstood. Somewhere else, far from the investigation, the man who built the device was paying close attention. He read the reports carefully, not with excitement, but with confirmation. They hadn't understood it. That mattered, because misunderstanding, to him, meant opportunity. The next incident came. Months later, then another, each one slightly different, each one slightly more deliberate, but still no clear pattern. The targets shifted, the locations changed. Investigators searched for connections that weren't there and missed the one that was. The FBI eventually became involved, but even then, the early profiles didn't help. They looked for groups, organizations, networks. They imagined anger expressed outward, not a philosophy refined inward. Over years of isolation, they assumed ideology came first, and action followed. In this case, it was the opposite. At one point, letters began to arrive. They were strange, dense, uncompromising. Not threats, not demands, arguments, long, carefully constructed explanations about technology, society, and what the future was becoming. Most of them were dismissed. Crank mail, radical rambling. Nothing new. No one connected them to the devices yet. And why would they? Words don't usually explode. Years passed. The incidents continued. Slowly, deliberately. The investigation expanded, but clarity didn't. Each new event felt related, but not enough to define the whole. The case gained a nickname, not because it was understood, but because it needed to be called something. And even with a name, it still had no face. What investigators didn't realize was that the most important evidence wasn't physical, it was linguistic. The devices were tools, the letters were the message, but that connection would take years to recognize, because it required listening differently, not for noise, but for voice. By the mid-1990 seconds, the case had become something else entirely. Not louder, not clearer, just heavier. Years had passed, multiple attacks, multiple victims, and still no face, no clear suspect, no explanation that truly fit. The investigation had grown massive, but understanding had not. The FBI had built profiles, then rebuilt them. They imagined organizations, cells, underground networks. They searched for patterns and materials, locations, delivery methods. But the case refused to behave the way other cases did. There was no escalation toward chaos, no rush. Everything about it felt deliberate, measured, almost patient. Why now? The letters could no longer be ignored. They were too consistent, too structured, too coherent. This wasn't random rage. It was an argument against modern society, against technology, against the direction the world was moving. Each letter returned to the same ideas: control, loss of autonomy, the illusion of progress. To most people, they sounded extreme. To investigators, they sounded familiar, but still disconnected from the crimes. That disconnect would last for years. Eventually, the FBI made a controversial choice. They agreed to publish the manifesto, not because they agreed with it, but because they were running out of options. The idea was simple. If someone out there recognized the writing, recognized the voice behind the words, They might come forward. It was a gamble. Some believed it would only amplify the message. Others believed it was the only move left. In 1995, the manifesto was released to the public. Somewhere in the United States, a man read the manifesto and felt something tighten in his chest. Not shock, recognition. Certain phrases felt familiar, certain rhythms, certain obsessions. It wasn't just what was being said, it was how it was being said. The precision, the fixation, the tone of certainty. He had heard this voice before, for years, at home. The man's name was David Kaczynski, and the person he was thinking about was his older brother. David didn't want to be right. He reread the text, again and again. Each time, the similarities became harder to dismiss. The worldview, the phrasing, even specific arguments matched things his brother had written years earlier. This wasn't evidence yet. It was intuition. And intuition can be terrifying when it points towards someone you love. David faced a choice no one prepares for. If he stayed silent, people could continue to be hurt. If he spoke up, he could destroy his own family. He consulted quietly, sought legal advice. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want attention. He wanted certainty. And certainty, in cases like this, comes at a cost. What ultimately convinced investigators was not a fingerprint, not a device, but language. Experts compared the manifesto to personal letters written years earlier. They looked at sentence structure, word choice, recurring ideas. The voice matched, not perfectly, but enough to justify a closer look. Investigators followed the trail, away from cities, away from institutions, away from people, to a remote cabin. No electricity, no running water, no phone. Inside, they found writings, drafts, notes, diagrams. Not chaos, but order. The kind of order that takes years to build. When agents finally entered the cabin, there was no confrontation, no chase, no resistance. The man inside didn't run. He didn't argue. He watched quietly. As years of isolation were interrupted, what they found there was not a hideout. It was a life. The cabin was small, barely furnished. No electricity, no running water, no comforts meant to soften time, but it was carefully constructed. Everything had a purpose. Nothing felt temporary. This wasn't a place someone fled to. It was a place someone chose. Inside were boxes of writing, drafts of essays, notes on technology, arguments refined over decades. There were diagrams, calculations, and personal journals. What stood out was not anger. It was consistency. The same ideas, repeated carefully, over and over again. This wasn't impulse. It was a worldview. Once the arrest was public, another question surfaced immediately. How does someone like this happen? Not how do they commit crimes, but how does a person reach this point without anyone stopping it earlier? The answers were uncomfortable because there was no single cause. Attention returned to his childhood, the experiments, the pressure, the isolation that followed. Some researchers argued those experiences played a role. Others said they were being overstated. What everyone agreed on was that the environment mattered. Years of reinforcement. Years without meaningful challenge. Years of beliefs deepening in isolation. No moment alone explained it, but together they formed a path. The public wanted clean explanations, someone to blame, something to point to, but this case didn't offer that. The institutions involved had followed their rules. The family had tried to help. No one had ignored obvious violence, because there hadn't been any. Just words, ideas, silence. And silence is hard to act on. With the arrest complete, people returned to the manifesto. Some dismissed it entirely. Others, uncomfortably, found parts of it persuasive. That made the situation worse, because it blurred a line. People prefer to keep clear. Understanding is not agreement, but separating the two requires care. The FBI quietly adjusted its methods. Language analysis gained importance. Behavioral patterns were reconsidered. Cases driven by ideology were no longer treated as fringe. The lesson wasn't publicized, but it was learned. The man who had once been invisible became a case number. His cabin became evidence. His words became exhibits, and the long silence that preceded everything was finally broken. But the relief people expected never really came. After the arrest, people expected closure, an ending, a sense that the danger was over. But that isn't what happened. What followed was not relief. It was unease. On paper, the case was solved. The devices stopped. The letters stopped. The threat was contained. But emotionally, nothing felt complete. Because this wasn't a story with a single turning point. It was a long process, one that had unfolded quietly over decades. And once people understood that, the question changed. Not how it happened, but how long it took for anyone to truly notice. The warning signs weren't dramatic. There were no threats shouted into the world. There were ideas, beliefs, arguments refined in isolation. And for a long time, those things didn't seem dangerous enough to intervene. This case forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth. Isolation doesn't always look like distress. Sometimes it looks like discipline, like withdrawal, like someone who keeps to themselves. And in societies that value independence, that kind of isolation can go unquestioned. For years, there was a tension in how the public responded. Some wanted to understand what shaped the man behind the crimes. Others feared that understanding would turn into justification. But those two things are not the same. Understanding is not agreement. Explaining is not excusing. And refusing to understand doesn't prevent repetition. In the years that followed, law enforcement adjusted, not loudly, not publicly. Language analysis became more important. Patterns of belief were taken more seriously. Isolation was reconsidered as a potential risk factor. The changes weren't dramatic, but they were permanent. David Kaczynski did not become a hero. He didn't seek attention. He didn't profit from the decision he made. He lived with it. And that may be the most difficult part of this story, because sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel right at all. This is not a story about intelligence, or ideology, or even violence. It's a story about what happens when certainty grows in isolation, when ideas harden without resistance, when silence feels like confirmation, and when no one hears the shift until it's too late. It's easy to believe that danger announces itself, that it arrives loud, obvious, and visible. But this story reminds us that some of the most destructive paths begin quietly, with someone who feels unheard, unseen, and absolutely certain that they are right. This has been Panda Detective Bureau. Thank you for staying with this story, and for listening carefully, not just to what happened, but to how it began. Until next time.